Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's been lovely. So as Neil was saying, I am a philosopher who thinks seriously about the intersections between philosophy and the sort of cognitive sciences, particularly psychology and neuroscience, for how we think about memory. I think of this as a capacity where our philosophical conceptions of what it is that memory might require and our evidence about what memory actually looks like have been very rough to put together. And so a lot of what I've done over the years is trying to think about different, it's kept me busy trying to figure out how to put those two things together. And the project today is really the kind of central instance of that I'm working on. So I appreciate the chance to talk to you about that in general. So I'm going to talk about memory traces and engrams. The memory trace and engram are both concepts or ideas that have been around for a long time. They're both well-established or at least long-standing concepts in their respective fields. Of course, the existence of their respective fields are quite different in terms of how long they've existed, so they differ in that respect. But the idea of a memory trace in some form or another has been around in philosophy for almost as long as philosophers have talked about memory. So when Aristotle talked about the capacity to retain events, he often likened the memories that would be formed to impressions in wax held into the mind. Right? The idea of there being some sort of way that you would store past impressions as a way of making possible the idea of remembering is, roughly speaking, the memory trace. I'm just going to gesture at that for the moment. The idea of an engram has not been around nearly as long, in part because neuroscience as a field of inquiry has not been around nearly as long, but it's a term that comes actually from the zoologist Richard Zeman in the early 20th century. So both of these ideas have been there for a long time, but in some sense, like a lot of, or at least like some old concepts, they've been dusty, so to speak. So they exist, people know of them, but they haven't gotten a lot of attention or interaction, or if they're definitely not cool. But that's changing in the way that both memory trace and engram are in their respective areas, making something of a comeback or having a resurgence for different reasons. Partially for the memory trace, it's because there now is a kind of active area of philosophy known as the philosophy of memory. That wasn't a thing a couple of decades ago in the way that things like philosophy of perception or philosophy of agency and those things mark particular disciplines. There is now, and as that happens, there are more people talking about memory traces, for better or worse. And in the neuroscience of memory, the concept of the engram hadn't gone very far until the advent of a lot of new tools and technologies, which I'll say more about in a little bit, that have brought this concept sort of back to the front. So long, dusty concepts that have recently been dusted back off. And as that's happened, philosophers and neuroscientists aren't interacting a great deal about them, but there's been a sort of practice of using the terms interchangeably, just swapping them out one for the other. I'm just giving you two fast examples. There's a book recently by two neuroscientists where the book is titled Engrams, A Window into the Memory Trace. And just to make clear that I'm not picking on other philosophers, I'm also picking on myself. Philosophers, even really, really smart ones, will say things like engram is a new word for an old idea, where that idea is memory trace. So using the terms as if they were interchangeable is a somewhat established practice. And really the question that I'm after here, what I'm wanting to just pause and think, is whether we really should be doing that. Should we be using these terms interchangeably? And do we actually understand what the relationship is between them? And I want, really what I'm going to say is effectively no. Well, you don't ask questions in philosophy talks unless you're going to say no, and I'm definitely going to say no. But what I want to say is, like, of course it makes sense. I mean, it's not like it's crazy for one to think that these have something to say. Like, obviously, it makes sense for them to come together and for us to recognize that we're talking about phenomena in the same ballpark, and there's a reason to be in dialogue about them, but that actually the kind of quick collapse into switching a sort of treating them as if they were synonyms in this way is masking a lot of things we really don't understand about either concept or the relationship that exists between them. And that, it's sort of, even though it looks like a nod to being interdisciplinary, to say, like, the thing I'm doing here, now they've found it in the other discipline, or vice versa, is actually getting in the way of what I think can be actually very beneficial interdisciplinary exchange, where the resources of one can help guide the other and vice versa. So I'm going to try to, in the background here is, like, I think of this as an interesting place for doing what is really substantive interdisciplinary work in philosophy of cognitive science, which is why I thought it might be the right thing to say in this sort of context, where I think there are ways that tools and methods of discovery in the life sciences can really help in establishing or working through some sorts of philosophical ideas and criteria. And similarly, a lot of the distinctions and sort of theoretical ways of framing things that philosophers have can be very useful to guiding forms of inquiry. So this is my, at least, storybook. In my storybook version of how this goes, there's a lot to be gained on both sides from going more slowly in how we think about this relationship. So I'm going to try to do that today. I'm going to start by saying a little bit more to give you more background about the memory trace concept, sort of where it came from, how it's been treated, why it's come back, and what puzzles it has. Then same for the Engram concept in neurobiology. So hopefully by the time we get through that, you can kind of see what these concepts really are, why you might think they're the same thing, but also have worries about whether they're the same. I'll then kind of quickly go through what I take the problem to be, and why that just really sets us up to question what the relationship might be, but how we should think about the relation of these terms. And then I'll give you you can't really see that. Can you see that? The solution is hidden. It's a surprise, and which is good because it's still very sketchy, but I have ways of thinking about a kind of proposal for how it is that we should understand that relationship and the ways they can contribute to one another. So that's the plan for today. Okay, drink of water. Is that visible? Can you see the bottom of the screen? Okay. Okay, so for philosophers reasoning about memory, the memory trace comes in. In some ways, it's a somewhat transparent component of theorizing about memory. So there is very little theorizing about memory that doesn't bring the idea of the memory trace along with it in ways that I think are quite difficult for how it is that people conceptualize this, such that there's not a lot of mental space between thinking about what remembering is and that there is this sort of trace that's there for the act of remembering. But really, the kind of style or method of reasoning, very generically or generally speaking, is to think about the activity of remembering, or the activity of having a representation in mind, and how you might say, is this an instance of remembering? And then asking questions about what requirements that would have to meet in order to be remembering, or what would have to be the case for remembering in that kind of way to be possible. And once that gets going, you get lots of criteria, unsurprisingly, very different criteria from different people, but the memory trace comes in. So it's in asking questions about what remembering requires, or how it is that the capacity to retain information is possible, that you get appeals to something like a memory trace. That comes in lots of different forms and flavors. People don't spend a lot of time belaboring what they think a memory trace is. I think you have to sort of unearth it in various ways, which I've done in a couple of cases. But accounts of why you might need a memory trace to explain remembering come from everything from the fact that, mental thought requires an object. And if you're thinking about the past, there's no past, so you need something here in order to do it. Or thinking well, there's got to be some sort of, connection to the past event, and you can't have action at a distance. The arguments of this kind in different ways from different philosophers give you different arguments for a memory trace. But for the most part, arguments for them don't go much further than that in terms of saying what a memory trace is, or how it must operate, or what its sort of criteria are. Philosophers leave very few things under-theorized, but this is one thing I think people really routinely have not had much to say about. In fact, oftentimes, I really like this quotation from this historian of psychology who says, the history of memory is a little like a tour of the depositories of a technology museum, and that when people talk about memory, they very quickly say, memory has to have some kind of method of storage for these traces. It's like impressions in wax, or it's like weaving a loom, or it's like a phonographic record, or it's camera obscura. And this is not unique to memory. We use these kinds of metaphors when we make sense of the mind more generally. But I think there's a way in which the metaphors for memory are particularly sort of entrenched and they're not things we easily dispose of for actual kind of theory and substance. So we get a lot of sort of computer metaphors, items in organized into a library or a warehouse, et cetera, are often ways that we think about memory traces. So not a lot of articulation of the arguments, and not a lot of accounting for what the details of those are, but it's an idea that sort of lurks and is a part of how people think about memory generally in philosophy. So when philosophy of memory kind of kicks up as a field, I was just doing this as proof of existence conditions, that there is a field now that as of 2017, there's an SEP article, and there actually is a philosophy of memory organization. It's just my fast, necessary, and sufficient conditions for a subfield, I guess. But now that there are people writing about philosophy of memory that are coming from philosophy of mind and epistemology and science, et cetera, now there are many people kind of questioning what the requirements are, how memory works, what sorts of relations it bears to other important and privileged philosophical concepts. And as philosophy of memory has become a kind of area of inquiry of its own, not just memory as a thing that's invoked in other areas, one of the central questions that arises is does remembering actually require a memory trace? Should we really, when we're trying to articulate what it is how it is that remembering works, or how it differs from perception and imagination and other capacities, or how we might distinguish its successful cases from its non-successful cases, there's been an incredible amount of pushback on the idea that there is a memory trace, where part of that is just a kind of, I think this is fair to say, even though I'm not someone with, I'm a sort of pro-trace person, but there's kind of lurking idea that there's something dusty about this concept, that it's outdated, it's unscientific, it's old-fashioned, and doesn't really have a place as philosophy of memory now tries to have some broadly naturalistic alignment with the sciences, so to speak. And that maybe part of that worry is that the idea of a trace is this kind of static, fixed sort of thing, and we know a lot about how brains work, and they're very fluid and dynamic, and so that looks like it doesn't fit. Or maybe, and what is often the bigger worry for them, is now we know a whole lot about how memory works empirically, and we know that memory is very prone to errors in very systematic ways that you can often think you're remembering when you aren't. And so then you might question, if the whole point was that retention, this is the thing that lets me know I'm remembering. I'm shining the light on the, items stored in my head. It's in the Inside Out movie style version of doing that kind of thing, then that gives you an argument for a memory trace. But if sometimes it seems like I'm doing that and I'm wrong about that, then the idea that that has to be supported by a memory trace is at least called into question. And so a lot of people say, well, we can wonder whether this is just a feeling we have that there should be a trace, or whether there actually is one. And perhaps we should even rethink the function and purpose of memory entirely. Maybe memory is really for making up stories headed towards the future that are plausible than it is storing information from the past that secures knowledge or something like that. So there's a lot of tension and debate over whether people have memory traces, and in fact a kind of central debate in the philosophy of memory that has occurred more recently. You can really, I have a paper with another colleague who is not a trace theorist, saying you can divide the field into proponents of kind of causal or post-causal theories, where causal theories of memory are really kind of trace theories of memory, thinking you need some sort of continuing criterion, and the post-causal theories are ones to say, no, you don't. It's more of a constructive and generative process that guides remembering. And so it is a sort of central debate amongst which you can divide a lot of views in contemporary philosophy of memory, do you need a trace or not? So long-standing idea, not particularly well fleshed out, and now that people are thinking about it a lot, an issue of a contentious one amongst philosophers of memory. Okay, so then for the engram, in the case of the memory trace, we're really reasoning from the activity of remembering sort of backwards to what could have made that kind of thing possible. In general, the kind of inquiry that guides thinking about the engram moves in the opposite direction. It's really a way of saying, here's an experience or some piece of information or event that happens. How is that information encoded into the system such that it can be held onto? So it's a lot of investigating the kind of mechanisms by which information is encoded into the brain, trying to keep track of or looking for whether or not you can actually identify what the memory relevant parts of that component are, and then track them over time, presumably up until the time that you retrieve that piece of information, right? So if I were to say, where the general line of thinking is, if I started doing jumping jacks right now, something odd that you would not have expected someone to do in the middle of a talk. And then an hour later, you get home in 2 hours, someone asks you how the talk was, and you're like, it was fine until she started doing jumping jacks. The fact that you could recall that happened, right, means something happened, and this was very strange, who knows why that happened, but it happened, and now you can later recall that, you can describe it, you can picture it in your mind. What explains that change? There has to be something in your brain that changed as a function of experiencing that, which is then responsible for that activity later. That's the general thought, and what neuroscientists are trying to do is figure out, of all the changes that are happening, which one is responsible for keeping track of the fact that the speaker is doing jumping jacks that later makes that possible for you to articulate. That's the general kind of idea. Calling that an engram, unlike memory trace, which has maybe has a particular origin in the kind of early modern period, but there's ways of talking about memory images as trace-like representations. Earlier, it's kind of like, it's contentious to say who first said memory trace, in what language, and how and why. For Engram, it's not. So Engram has a very particular coining in the work of the zoologist Richard Zeman at the turn of the 20th century. He wrote it in German in 1904, and it was translated into English in the 1920s, where he's writing, when I talk about Zeman, I often talk about him as like the Mendel of memory. So like he is to memory what Mendel is to the gene. Like has this, except of course Mendel didn't say gene, so it's not perfect, but it's helpful because most people haven't heard of him. But he's a kind of, so he didn't actually investigate where memories would be in the brain. It's not because he discovered them that he invoked this term. He invoked this term because he thought, there has to be something. I'm thinking about the general practices of how it is that memory works, and there has to be something. There has to be, on this kind of jumping jack theory, there has to be something, some kind of change that explains how this kind of retention is possible. I don't know where it is. I don't know how it works. Whatever it is, let's call it the engram. Let's kind of theorize about how it works in the same way that Mendel thought heredity had to be sustained by particular kinds of processes that he thought he could express rules about, even though he had no idea how it was that genes actually worked yet, right? So Zeman's sort of putting the idea out there, but doesn't have anything to back it up. And there's a very tragic history of Zeman's own life. Zeman himself does not become very popular until, again, recently. People haven't heard of him much, but his term sticks around. And in some sense, there is a search for the engram that takes off as a function of his work, but not really because of Zeman. Or if people know the term engram in the memory sciences, they often don't think of him. They think of Carl Lashley, who by the 1950s, who spent much of the middle of the 20th century searching for the engram across different species, mostly doing experiments with rabbits where he would train them to do things and then lesion very small bits of the cortex to see if he could find which parts might be responsible, and lots of attempting to do this and unable to find it. And just in general, he's like a philosopher scientist. He is just like counterexample, he's just going to hammer it into the ground until no one wants to say the word engram anymore, is the short way of saying what he was up to empirically. And he has this beautiful quote at the end of his paper about searching for the engram, where he says, like, I sometimes feel, in reviewing my exhaustive evidence of how I've never found any mechanism that could support this, that the necessary conclusion is that learning isn't possible, right? Like, if you think memory requires a trace, I'm telling you I can't find one, so there's no memory. Like, take that. It's really lovely. But because of this, the term sticks around. The idea, like in general, people who are doing neurobiology of memory remain committed to the general idea of this jumping jack style theory, that if you have a particular kind of experience that you're able to later recall or retain or express in your behavior, that there has to be some sort of change that makes that possible. But the search for the engram as a kind of quest, as something that shows up as a search term or as an identified research practice, very much dies down after Lashley. So you see it in the work of a few people, but it's not a term you're going to get popular for using in neuroscience for the second half of the 20th century. So instead, which is not to say that people stop doing research on memory. Studying and investigating the basic underlying processes of memory remains a central project for cellular molecular neuroscience up until this day. There's no way to do all of that on one slide. But instead to say, like, a lot of what's happened is a deep investigation of what the mechanisms of memory are. That's a central project. There have been several Nobel Prizes won about discoveries of different components of this process. I think one of the best ways to exemplify it as like one of the most established set of phenomena in neuroscience is the fact that philosophy of neuroscience, people like John and Carl Craver, use this as a kind of established example about which you can argue different philosophical accounts of explanation, which one best characterizes it. Because we know so much about how the mechanisms work, like what the processes themselves are, then there's enough there for philosophers to say, this best accounts for it, no, this best accounts for it. And if it were sort of in development, it wouldn't be the right area of neuroscience to be sort of having those kinds of debates, right? So we know a great deal about, in general, how memories are formed. But the commitment to an engram is about sort of particular the identification of particular memories. So, right, we might know that spatial memory happens in the hippocampus. Like if you take that part of the brain out, you're not going to be able to navigate. But what we haven't been able to do, or what neuroscience hadn't been able to do, is say, and there's the spatial memory of you walking across campus, right? We can say, here's where, object pairing memory happens. But we can't say, here's the memory of you pairing this object with this context, right? And it's the latter thing that an Engram argument would require you to do. Like, there's the Engram, not there's the general thing that we think makes Engrams, right? So for a long time, we knew a lot about the mechanisms, but we didn't have to say anything about Engrams until more recently, when a set of neurobiologists have declared that we are now in the midst of an Engram renaissance, which they say in like small print, I think is a great phrase, and they should highlight more. So the Engram renaissance. So now we're in a stage where we actually can identify and say, there is the spatial memory of, not your walk across campus, but potentially a mouse's walk across campus, and not your putting an object in a context, but a mouse's ability to do so, which is possible because of the development of a wide range of tools in neuroscience, like optogenetics and chemogenetics, I'll say something very brief about, that now allows for, in rodents, in particular in other small animals, the ability to activate and tag memories as they're being formed in ways that make them light sensitive, such that you can then turn on or turn off and manipulate that memory by re-exposing that animal to light. It's an incredible and seemingly bizarre transition that has really changed the way that we're capable of doing memory research with rodents. It's allowed for a transition from saying lots of things about mechanisms to saying things about individual memories. Terrifying and cool all at the same time. So the Engram Renaissance really is a way of talking about a set of techniques. So it's a lot of technological advances happening at the same time. Some of them are just advances in imaging, the ability to do very high resolution 2-photon imaging of individual neurons in the brain. So you've got the ability to do staining and tracing in ways that are going to allow you to see. And like now poor RAs, I guess maybe ChatGPT is doing some of it now, like counting individual neurons that have turned pink versus turned green. Because we have that level of precision about what you can do things. So the ability to tag and take very high detailed, high resolution images, along with things like optogenetics, which are sort of depicted with this, that's a rat from the Dice-Rat lab at Stanford, where what you're doing is taking, you're basically making it so that these rodents will express light-sensitive proteins, the kind of proteins that you would find in like moss and algae and other things that are sensitive to the growth of light in ponds and things of that sort. You find a way to inject those into a very specific set of neurons such that those neurons will be active when light shines on them. In my way of saying this, which I've been told by the scientists that do this, is a passable way of saying it. Like it's like you went in and put a light switch on each one of those cells. It gives you the capacity to put a light switch on a cell and turn it on and off in a living, behaving organism. Only mice and rats and other small creatures at this point. But you can do this, and there's lots of fancy details about how it is you do this. But you can do this in the case of memory in a particular way. So optogenetics and other tools of this sort have really revolutionized neuroscience, because this is a level of power and precision that didn't exist before. And a lot of his work, John has done that's really interesting theorizing about how, in general, these kinds of tools have revolutionized neuroscience. And I think that is a really powerful point to make. And I've kind of echoed in saying, and this is like one of the best particular examples of why that kind of phenomenon is true. So in these experiments, imagine this like 3x3 grid is like a representation of neurons in the sort of memory-forming dentate gyrus areas of the mouse's brain, right? So highly schematic and not real, but for our purposes. So you've got a mouse that's been genetically engineered so that they are ready to express these light-sensitive proteins in the areas that form memory. But they're held on doxycycline, which is the same antibiotic you get put on if you have a really bad sinus infection. Says all sorts of creepy things about that phase of antibiotics, but that's a different talk. But so while they're on it, none of those light-sensitive proteins will express themselves. So while you're on that antibiotic, because they're like going after the RNA in your cells, it's very terrifying. But while you're on it, you won't express the light-sensitive protein. So they're just chilling out. None of their neurons have the light switch on them. Then you take the mouse and you put them in the conditioning chamber, and you take them off the medicine, and you shock them. So they've had one experience, like whatever neurons in their memory area register that they got shocked are now going to, this is what the star depicts, get light switches, effectively, right? And then you put them back on the medicine, you take them to, you're just like letting them hang out someplace else. They've turned blue because they now are like the light sensitive, the light switch has been built. And then you keep them on the medicine, you put them in like you don't even take them back to where they were. Like normally if you took a mouse back to where it had been shocked, it will freeze because it knows you're about to do that again. Now you keep them in a place that they actually like, but you turn on the light, you flip the switch on the neurons, and they will freeze as if they were in that context. So I am justified in saying you've put a light switch on the memory, which is incredible. And this is the kind of basic proof of concept that you could do this happened in 2012. In the 13 years since then, the ability, like now you have like an independently manipulable switch on memories in this way. It's a whole like kind of new realm of intervention. So once you can turn the memory off and on, you can now manipulate it in all sorts of ways. You can put the mouse in a different context and switch the valence of the memory from happy to sad, or like positive, aversive to rewarding, I guess is the better terminology we'd want to use here, but you can flip the valence of the memory. You can stop them from doing the processes by which the memory would be turned into a long-term memory, but show that the light switch is still there and you can turn it on. You can give them models of dementia and try to see whether or not the capacity is still in there. You can track how this develops over time. You can put them under different amounts of stress. You can have them have you can do all sorts of really cool stuff. And then once you know enough about the specific ones and specific organisms, you can even go in and make a fake engram in a mouse that's never had an experience and make them have an aversive reaction to something they've never smelled before. For that one, you have to use smell. But like all sorts of things are available to you. This is why they call it a renaissance, right? This is like, now we went from like, so that in the paper where they call this, actually not in that paper, in a different paper, the paper, people that coined the term Engram Renaissance will say like, not only have we now found the engram, like we now have the means to control it. Like we've identified it, we can track it, and we can manipulate it over time. It's a massive advance in the way that the cellular molecular neuroscience of memory gets done. It's incredibly cool. My excitement hasn't made that clear enough. It's incredibly cool. But you might think the reception in the broader neuroscience, in some sense, can be like summed up like this amongst like cognitive neuroscientists and neuroscientists in other areas, like, so what? Like there's a kind of where it's hard to defend that in some ways, because part of what that reaction is a function of nobody talking about it in the right way, not getting the right kind of upkeep or uptake amongst neuroscientists working in other areas. One of the few exceptions is Sharon Ranganath, who is a cognitive neuroscientist at UC Irvine, who in two places, once in a small TICS paper, and once like literally in an endnote of his book, this is as much attention as the Engram can get, is like, yeah, but it's not really memory. Like this is just kind of basic low-level association stuff. We don't really need to take this seriously, right? It's brought us closer, but there's a huge gap between this kind of stuff and real memory. So there is amongst, I think, people that are doing the Engram work and advocating for this renaissance, who are doing massively cool work, feel like they're having difficulty being taken seriously as doing work that's significant, that actually speaks to memory formation processes. For what are, I mean, I don't have time to defend this today. Huh?
The ghost of Endel told.
Yeah, but Endel liked Engrams, so I think he's actually the source of, I think he's the solution maybe to remind them of that. But there is a way in which it is an incredibly uphill battle for reasons I can't defend today, but I think for reasons that have to do with kind of entrenched sociological communities in science, not actual, there's not a lot of there in the arguments that are resistant in the ways that you would suggest, but making that point apparent is a challenge in these cases. But effectively, I mean, this is just to say, like, trying now to kind of sum up where we are with both of these projects, that they're kind of compatible but distinct projects in how they reason with regards to the memory trace and the engram. So reasoning backwards from remembering or retrieval versus kind of reasoning forward from encoding. That where historically, we haven't had a lot of details about what memory traces are, a broad sort of commitment to them, but largely metaphorical. And in the history of neuroscience, a lot of thinking and understanding the mechanisms, but it's been very rare to actually get to the particulars. And now, as these things have come back, there are questions in memory about whether we really need these traces, and for people doing Engram work, questions about whether these things really are memories, right? That each field sort of, there's a comeback, but there's also a lot of pushback, effectively, in the background. Okay, I think I'm okay. So there's a problem. So I've been saying, well, that people are using these terms interchangeably. I don't know that you need more evidence. There's me again saying it, so to prove I'm not just picking on other people. Another philosopher has a paper saying, what have we learned about the Engram? And the first sentence of the paper is the question of the nature of memory traces. Like, everybody does this, sometimes explicitly, as Nicola does, and a footnote says, like, look, these terms are used synonymously by basically everybody except Muhammad Ali Khalidi. So people are using the terms interchangeably. Like, what's wrong with that if they are convergent in different ways? What's the problem? And I think really the problem is, you can start to see the problem by seeing, like, hopefully by having laid out this background in kind of like what people think they have to gain by making the connection or making the synonymy or sort of linking up with the other field. And that, in a way, when philosophy, like, if there's a debate about whether or not memory traces are a thing, whether this is the kind of requirement that you need, it turns out to be great if scientists have already found them, right? Then you're like, debate one, because there they are, right? Like, we are in the midst of a renaissance, people. Like, it's here. Debate over, right? We have, do you need memory traces? Well, we've made some good cases for it, and there they are. In the case of Engram neuroscience, that appealing to or linking up with the idea of a memory trace is a way to push back on all the people that challenge whether or not what they're investigating are actually memories. So it helps to link to the kind of significance of what they're doing, right? If this is an age-old concept, they can link not only to Zeman, but to Plato or to Aristotle, as they often do now in the introductions to their papers. They say, like, this idea of a memory trace started a long time ago, right? And part of what they're trying to do is convey the significance of their discovery and make this connection to the kind of capacity that we care about and have expressed in philosophical terms. So there's sort of motivation from both ends to, each side has its own motivations for making allegiances to the other. But of course, this only works, I mean, in both cases, there isn't really a there, at least in terms of the kind of definitions that you would want to have for, like, neither side really has a great conception of what it is, what their sort of central phenomena is, in ways that I'll try to defend in just a minute. And so part of what they're doing is sort of hoping to get the legitimacy from the other side. But since it's a kind of mutual grabbing in the sense, what we don't have is the kind of clarification about what this sort of concept or phenomena at the heart of this actually is. So it's somewhat premature to say, like, oh, problem solved in both directions. Because when it comes to, like, and how exactly did we solve it? Like, what was the, like, what exactly is it again? Like, both of them are going to point at the other, and we're not going to actually get anywhere in terms of understanding the phenomenon. So this is a sort of concern about why it is that the relationship is too, or sort of the synonymy practice is too quick. Because it doesn't really allow us to understand, I guess I was going to defend the idea that, like, when we're defining memory, and so just to back up the idea that people, even as people talk about them in philosophy of memory nowadays, we don't actually define what memory traces are. I think part of the back and forth about, like, do we really need them? Is this a really old concept that we don't have to keep around? Often nowadays when people do sort of express their commitment to there still being memory traces, they'll do so in ways that dilute the notion in different ways. So they'll say, like, well, of course there's traces, but they're distributed, they're not localized. Or they're embodied and extended, they're not internal states. Or they're dispositional, they're not explicit. Or they're possible, but they're not required. And, like, this is just a sort of set of examples of ways that people do this thing. And you might wonder over time, like, so what is it that makes something a memory trace? Like, no one's holding on to any of the same features when they do this. And in fact, there are people that will hold a view of sort of distributed mental representations that are responsible for remembering and say, this is not a memory trace view. And someone else will say, well, it is a memory trace view because my traces are distributed. And you're like, what makes it a trace? Like, there's not really any kind of idea about what the actual kind of minimal conditions on that sort of a commitment are. So trying to find an Engram is helpful if that gave you the minimal conditions, which unfortunately it might not. So from the other side, in terms of giving definitions of Engrams, there are criteria that people offer. That this is from the same group, Jocelyn and Franklin and Kohler writing together. They're trying to extract what they think comes from Zeman. But these are kind of very generic, like, oh, look, it has to be retained, it has to interact with retrieval. et cetera, which they've sort of kind of taken from Zeman's 1920 work. But of course, as they do more research, as more of this kind of mechanistic work into these things happens, you get research that challenges many of these things, or like, how exactly should we understand this? All right, so the research starts to make it complicated as to exactly what it would mean to hold on to these conditions. I mean, just as a simple point of reference, now that you can have people going in and counting the individual number of neurons that are activated, you can look at the number of them that absorb the light-sensitive protein during the experience. You can count. I mean, I don't actually have a sense of exactly what the numbers are, but say it's 87. And then you have the experience to come back. And it's also like, it's 91 neurons. And there's 57 that overlap between those two. Like, is that enough? Like, how much overlap does there have to be in order for this to count as the same? Like, you have that level of, you have a level of precision that outstrips anything that their definitions are doing, and no clear criteria that would help guide them as to, like, you know, what is it that we're going to be looking for that might help us count, that sort of thing. So on both sides, you have a question about what the relationship is. And of course, you can wonder, like, should we be, is this just two terms for the same thing? Is it, like, there's all sorts of ways we could understand this relationship. Is this a kind of, you know, role to realizer situation? Are we talking about implementation? Is this a kind of general to a particular? Just make a list of, you know, possible ways that you could have relation. Like, what's the right way to think about this? And there's lots of options. It's really not clear, even if you think they're kind of in the same territory, how it is you want to understand what the relationship is. This wasn't a very, this is just like to pump the idea that we don't really, even if they're kind of in the same ballpark, we don't know how it is we want to think about the ways in which they might be connected to one another. Okay, so the proposal for my last little bit, this is, because it's the positive part, it's very sketchy and fast, for a proposal of actually how to get them closer together, what to do in order to make, well, I guess pull them apart enough to bring them back together in a systematic and more coherent way, is to start by thinking about, like, why it is that they are coming together. Like, what exactly is it that makes them part of the same project? And it really is a kind of convergence on a kind of central thing to be explained, which is the retention of information that gets acquired from a particular event or experience in different ways. But for memory, that comes up because people are asking, like, what are the requirements on remembering? Where remembering gets distinguished from lots of other states, like general belief and knowledge, or perception, or imagination, by the kinds of connections it has to something that's no longer existent, and particular, right? It's sort of grounded in a way of connecting to something that happened in the past, and a particular way of connecting to it that you can only have if you've previously experienced that thing. There's a lot more to say about that, obviously, but that's the kind of sketch, right? And in the same way, part of what's happening, what people are doing when they're doing Engram work is trying to track whatever change is there from witnessing the jumping jacks, right? They're trying to hold on to, it's that, you know, as they're trying to figure out, like, which cells to follow, which thing. It's like, does this thing, I mean, if the mouse could talk, make them say she was doing jumping jacks whenever they turn the light switch back on, right? They're looking for something that has a connection back to that learning event. And in a sense, like, I mean, I'm going to go very fast in saying all this just to get the general idea out, but what they share is this idea that, like, the act of remembering, doing this sort of remembering, requires, what it takes to explain that retention, requires the formation and retention of a particular kind of mental representation. There's a particular way of having, a particular kind of mental state that is involved in pulling that sort of thing off, that has memory-specific constraints. So it's a particular kind of representation involved in memory that's different than is involved in other states, whether we're talking about those states philosophically or we're talking about them as sort of underlying mechanisms. And there's complementary roles, I think, for philosophy and neuroscience to play in helping one another give the right kinds of memory-specific constraints to get the right criteria out. I'm going to try to sketch that super fast. Okay, so part of that comes from saying, well, if they are mental representations, if this is a commitment to a sort of what is responsible for memory being a particular kind of mental representation, we can think about mental representations, a common way of thinking about them, is of having two components, loosely characterized and, like, yeah. I'm not going to create my own problems. It's your job to create problems for me when it gets there. So one way of thinking about mental representations is having two components, right? A content and a vehicle, right? So the content of the representation is just the meaning, is what is meant, what is expressed, what is represented. The content is Yeah, is that, which you can understand in different ways. Where the vehicle is the physical medium by which that content is carried, right? Whether that's going to have the kind of structure that supports the content in different ways. And there are lots of debates about how to understand different ways that contents and vehicles can be related or can constrain one another, but we think about those as different aspects of this kind of state. And I think doing that can help in various ways because it can be a way of saying how these things are getting onto the same phenomenon, where we can think about the memory trace as sort of after the content and the engram is after the vehicle, but they're talking about and trying to gesture at the same thing. Okay, so this is me trying to put up like what each is doing right and each is doing wrong very quickly. So there's a way in which philosophical accounts of what it takes to remember something that get you to a memory trace do a really good job of disambiguating remembering from other kinds of states. And sort of saying what kinds of particular contents are memory contents versus other contents, right? That has to do with, having the right kind of connection to the past, having it be something that you experienced, et cetera, right? At least going to do a good job of disambiguating the kinds of things that we have in mind. But when it comes to saying part of what it boils down to, no matter whether you're a trace person or not a trace person, is like you got to retain something, right? You can't remember things that either never happened to you. There is someone who defends of you, but it's just wild. It's not true. You can't remember something that didn't happen, and you can't remember something if you just never encoded it, right? If right after it happened, you just started staring at your phone and it just went away. If it's not there, it can't get remembered. So you've got to have some sense of retention. What's really an issue between trace and non-trace people is how? What are the requirements on how that retention goes, right? What is going to be enough for retraining it, everyone's got to think that part of what it is to be an organism that goes from a baby to a grown-up is that you have experiences, you figure some stuff out, and you get better at it. So clearly you're holding on to stuff and you're learning things. The trace requirement has got to be a commitment to a particular way of doing that, right? It's got to be something it's a debate about the nature of that representation. It is kind of technical, it's like a cognitive architecture question. It's how does a system have to be designed in order for it to be that kind of retention versus another kind, for there to be traces? And philosophy of memory hasn't done a very good job of saying what that might be, right? So there's not really good constraints or conditions on what would be required in that sense. In the case of Engram work, right, we have incredible characterizations of the vehicles of memory, gorgeous photos. I had put up on an original slide, I should have put back here. There's a picture of one where it's there's a white neuron next to a pink one, and the caption is literally non-engram cell, engram cell. That's the level of, and that is the splashy front image in this Nature article, where it's that's the level of precision we're working with now, people. That's the kind of conveyed content of the image, right? We have that level of precision about what an engram is. Incredible, and it's getting even more sophisticated. Every time there's a new paper, every time I go to a workshop, it's there's a new tool, and they can do something even fancier and even smaller. And now they're doing, they're sequencing the DNA of these, in real time. It's wild. So they can tell you every bit of detail you want to know. It's unclear which parts of the details matter, right? They can't tell, is 57 neurons of overlap? Is that good? If it moves in this way, is that right? That's where the kind of if the field is going to lose its way in the midst of this explosion, it's that what's driving the research forward is what can you do with this cool tool, not what necessarily are you following the engram anymore. It seems to be a kind of concern that you might have, right? So if that's the kind of, conveniently this works out so that they can help one another, right? So in some sense, in the ways that we get the kind of rich characterization, how they actually went about finding the engram, how they actually went about the process of discovery, doing experiments that show you necessity and sufficiency in neuroscientist terms, sort of tracking, showing that if you have these cells with the light switch and you keep them from being able to turn on, the memory, you will not get the behavior no matter what else you do, right? You won't get the memory to show up if you've got the light switch sort of on pause. And all you need to get the behavior back is the light switch, right? You can show sufficiency from the other end, that this is enough. You can take everything, you can lesion and inhibit and freeze lots of other things. As long as you keep the light switch, you've got it going. Those kinds of characterizations that they use on the vehicle can actually be really helpful for giving us the kinds of conditions that you would need to get a trace going. And then in the other direction, right, insofar as philosophers have done a nice job of characterizing what's really important for being something that's memory relevant versus just trafficking and information processing, that kind of work and sort of ways that we can distinguish between questions about the nature of content are helpful for giving Engram neuroscientists sort of criteria by which they can sort of start to think about things in memory relevant or non-memory relevant ways. And I'll say something super fast about that and then stop. So basically the idea is that we can use methods of Engram discovery in neurobiology to generate conditions on a minimal conception of what a trace could be, and use distinctions amongst the ways that philosophers can ask content determination questions to guide how it is that we look at Engram mechanisms. And I'll skip and really fast just quickly say, like the criteria that you can get, you can say like, well, in order to be a memory trace, and if you want to ask me later how I got there, it's just so I can stop in a second, yeah, feel free to ask me. But the criteria that you can get is like, you have to, like what it takes to be a memory trace is a kind of discrete retention, not necessarily local, but a kind of persistent change that isn't absorbed into kind of general representational capacities, and that actually is information bearing or content supporting in some way, because it has to track the learning event. It's got to be able to tell you about the jumping jacks or the freezing, the shock, or whatever it is that transpired previously. And in the case, I don't know why I put it that way. In the case of the Engram, part of what we're trying to ask, part of what's bugging Engram neuroscientists is that they're looking for all of these things about how neurons might be encoding information and moving things around. And you can ask lots of questions about how that happens, which are different than asking questions about them as representations of what actually happened, as things that are carrying content about the memory, which is not usually a way that they form those questions. And when you do start to form those questions in those ways, it can help you to disambiguate between relevant and non-relevant parts of the mechanism. So the hope is that expressing that there's lots of other things to figure out about this relation and lots of other benefits too, I think, from doing it. So this is just a kind of very preliminary sketch. But I think it does give us a way to think more productively about what the interchange between them could be. And so with that, I'll stop. So thanks.
Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do lab science. If you're not going to say, this is the operation, the behavioral measure I'm going to use as a measure of this particular memory in this particular context. And that's what it is. That's what the content of the memory is for that particular test. So you're not going to find it in here.
But now that that content is so now that they have this such beautiful characterization, they can make this way more complicated. Like, can I make it scarier? Can I make you do different things as a kind of behavioral expression? What kinds of things can I vary and show sensitivity to? Which I think is a way of saying, like, it's a way of saying what all is, like, the mouse knows, like, something bad happens to me. It's easy to anthropomorphize. Like, you can see them actively, like, they do not want to go back there. And that's very different from the way they behave in what looks maybe even to us like exactly the same place. It's just in a different location. Like, they clearly associate that context with bad things happening. But what does that mean? Like, are they anxious? Are they fearful? Are they anticipatory? Is it, what features are they relying on? Now you can vary, now you have a way to more systematically vary those and see, does it get, there's some interesting things about what that does. Like, does intensity of the shock change how strong the engram is or how many cells? It turns out not the number of cells involved. Like, that, the kind of structure of the memory seems to have a particular size regardless of whether it's positive or negative, how intense it is, and various, so like, it looks like there's something about getting a certain number of neurons together in the right way is what makes it hold on to the thing. It's not kind of context sensitive in that way. But it does seem to matter for other kinds of features, like what parts of the brain get involved in that encoding.
So I'm curious about whether or not the sort of the general gist of the field, or maybe what's going on in the literature, tells a slightly different story about different kinds of memories. So, like, I'm really interested in questions about locating yourself in space.
Yeah.
Having memories of your environment, like maybe where you left something in your house. The examples of content and of vehicle are pretty sort of atomistic here. How does the story scale to sort of useful pieces of memory?
Yeah.
That's vaguely, that triggers my visual thing that makes me think about.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good. So it's a great question. So part of what I think is kind of shared or like is hopefully related is the way in which you have this kind of particularity for those sorts of memories. So that's the hope. I mean, one of the reasons why this works so well at the kind of molecular level, especially the fear conditioning as like the initial ones that they did a lot of, is that it's one of the few cases you can get of like one-shot learning, like, you know, like sticking your hand on the stove. Like you don't have to do that 10 times to pick up on that. It's like not, you know, you do it once, you know, you don't do it again. And so you get, that's a different kind of learning. So in those ways, it looks like mechanisms that are more similar to the kind of, I mean, you can think of like episodic memories that we have of like, you know, some that we hold on to in short ways and some we hold on, like where I parked, well, I didn't park today, but, you know, where you parked when you drive someplace, and things like your 7th birthday or, you know, like monumental and episodic kinds of days, that those like are ways of holding on to what makes, from my way of thinking about it, what makes memory an interesting phenomenon to talk about relative to belief in other kinds of states is that sort of like, it's content that, like, of course it's informed by the concepts I have of all the relevant components, but it is about that particular experience. Like it's, the reference is tied to something having happened in a particular way at a particular time.
So I mean, is there a general theory about how learning sort of complex pieces of information, complex representation?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, no, and I think it's part of why the Engrams stuff, it's helpful for this to, I mean, yes and no, I guess is the answer. So there's one way of thinking that is, there's this idea of complementary learning systems. There's kind of like, a smart way to learn things is to have kind of two pathways. There's like a slow pathway by which I like extract the generalizations in my environment, right? I learn the norms of going to talks. I learn, you know, lots of experiences in the world. You get highly generalized, either statistical or however you want to put that together, kinds of knowledge, associationist knowledge. And then I also keep track of like particular things that happen. And like that I learn fast, right? And those things kind of shift in relative importance over time and they're complementary ways of learning that support different kinds of tasks. So that's one way that people have of doing, like, that's one model that exists, but on that model, the interesting, sophisticated, complicated stuff all happens in the slow system. The specific ones are supposed to wash out over time, or you don't keep them for forever and things of that sort. But then there's another way of thinking that is that all the low-level memories, low-level memories that are being studied in kind of Engram associationist work in animals are super simple. And human memories, this is kind of the Scharnrang outline, are massively complex things that are different every time we remember them, right? Like you think about events from your past, significant ones, like who you're with, what mood you're in, what's just happened, will influence the way that you construct that memory and in ways that can make you susceptible to error if you're in different kinds of circumstances. Right? And so that kind of malleability, you understand, an event one way, then you go to therapy, and then, you think about it a different way. Right? That kind of way of doing things, there's this like massive malleability of the complex stuff that we do. And so people from the other end are like, this is how they're different ways of learning. This is the brute stuff, and this is the complicated stuff. And I think in some sense we need a different kind of theory or architecture about how these things might go together I think we need more models and proposals on the table for how these kinds of things work, because we clearly, I want to see there as being more complementariness between these kinds of projects, and I think that we need accounts, especially of human memory and learning, that aren't so error-driven, that most of the ways of accounting for that reconstructive stuff that I was just talking about have kind of skewed into the opposite direction of remembering is not about the past at all. It's just about reconstructing a plausible future. And that can't be, it's too far in the other direction. Memory is not a video recording of past events, but it's also not an entirely Bayesian, prediction of what the past might have been like. We would say really different things. It'd be shocking how much we get right and the particular ways we get things wrong if that were the case. And so we need a model that says maybe we shouldn't hold on to events in the past. Maybe we should update more frequently than we do, but we don't. And we are sort of grounded in this way. And so I think, there's no better answer out there yet, but I think there should be one. In part because some forms of complicated knowledge support more particular, or support more specificity, not just generalization. So sometimes things with experts are a good way of doing that. Like experts get massive generalization knowledge, but can also tell you highly specific things about like the particular chess moves in this particular game, right? And like those things are complementary. So it's not like generalizing always washes out specificity and things like that. So yeah, I have lots of thoughts about this, and there isn't a kind of general fast thing to say.
And that's why I made that comment about the ghost of Indra Tolkien. I mean, I think he convinced 3 generations of cognitive psychologists that there's nothing stable.
But he thinks there's something stable. They riff on him. They read. But even to the end, I mean, in like 2010, he says like, of course there's an engram. Like how could it be otherwise? Like there has to be one. He does think that humans have a lot of bells and whistles that other creatures don't, that allow you to do things with those. But like I think people read a gloss of him, but he doesn't fully think that. I don't know what he would have. He wasn't really around. I mean, he only died like 2 years ago, but he wasn't really like. I mean, he was like 95, so fair enough that he was not paying attention in the last, like he wasn't saying much about the kind of Engram stuff as it started to happen. I'm curious what he would have said.
And lastly, I'm curious what he would have said.
Yeah, he would have hated it just like on principle, I think, but yeah, how specifically he would have hated it.
So I think it's like after if we manage somehow to isolate those cells and somehow implant it into a mouse that never been tested on this, and then test that mouse, the first rule it will actually react after it's electrocuted.
Yeah, so it's not transplanting, but in the case of, these have been done with like olfactory memory, so like smell association with bad things, which has a particular mapping which makes this more possible. But you learn like, oh, this is an odor that mice have like really proprietary, like which set of cells it's going to be. Like so it's a very well mapped associationist thing. You can go in and make those cells already have those connections. And if you give, you can make it that way. They will freeze the first time they smell the smell. So you can artificially, it's a very constrained set of cases, but like it's very cool that they made it happen. It's kind of like it's on a dare, but.
But then actually, that just means that memory now turned into a procedure memory, not an episodic memory anymore?
Because they don't have an event.
Yeah.
I mean, not necessarily. Great. So that's a great question. I mean, some people would think that, like, look, insofar as we're doing associative memories and animals, these are all procedural. This is a kind of question or debate, but it's meant to be more like the sort of memory transplant cases in the sense of like total recall. Maybe that's a dated reference, but like it's meant to be a way of saying like once you know like how to get the right neurons to turn on for these things. So a lot is now known about like if you can measure the general activity of the cells in a region, you can kind of know which ones are going to contribute to the memory, and so you can drive their activity up and force them to be the cells that do it.
This is what neuroscientists just cheat. It's not even like that. It's hippocampal dependent, so it's declarative. That they learn from Larry Squire.
Yeah, but I mean, but the charm is, I mean, like those are hippocampus people that say these aren't memories in their procedure. So I think it's yeah.
Oh, but then, for example, like very far-fetched, if you lab-grown those like neurons and then implant, just like implant into like a massive.
Yeah.
So that's like kind of like how the theory of like memory enhance like drugs.
Yeah. So the idea that I mean, we were talking about Swamp Man earlier. These are very kind of like, if you sever the thing from its causal history, you like kind of give this, like, what's the content and how's it referring and is it going to, that becomes super, complicated for thinking about what that relationship is going to be. But it has the right kind of sort of vehicle to carry that content at least, even if you want to say, well, it's not content, but it's not going to be a memory content because it lacks the reference or, whatever. If you want to add other conditions, you could. Yeah, it's a good question.
Great. Thank you. This is basic, but we have memory, trace, term/concept, and brain. It's very easy to fall into just calling them either one more than just memories.
Yeah.
Refer to individual.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So why do we need either term?
Oh, instead of just saying memory? Yeah, I mean, I guess some of it is a matter of, yeah, I mean, this is one of the places, memory's not unique in this, but like there's so many different things you can mean by this kind of idea. So like you might think that like you don't really have memory, at least in the sense of like remembering, like active, like, you know, presumably there's plenty of stuff in your head, this is sometimes depressing too when I think about it this way, that you will never ever recall, even though you could, right? If you were like, you decide not to go to trivia tomorrow night, but if you went to trivia tomorrow night, they would ask a random question that you just happen to know the answer to because you were obsessed with baseball cards for 1 year when you were 10, right? Like, and like, but had you not gone to trivia, that piece of information would have just hung out in your head, like, till your dying day, never having been called to mind, right? And so like sometimes what you want is a way of distinguishing, I mean, maybe for memory you might not need it, but like there's different components and different kinds of things involved in how you might think about that. So like you might not think that you have the memory until you have an act, or you might think the act of remembering is like an explicit representation of that particular thing that comes about at a particular time, which is different from having the capacity or something of that. So you want the ability to make that distinction, like, because there's some things that like you think you could have done that at trivia, but you can't because it's not in there, right? Like maybe you don't know the difference, or maybe it's hard for you to figure out how you determine the difference. But presumably there's a difference between having that capacity and never getting a chance to express it, and not having the capacity and never getting put in the conditions where you would have discovered that.
So for that whole story,
Yeah.
you used information and memory.
Yeah.
If you want to tell more accurately, why do you need memory trace or memory?
Because I could say, I mean, the question about whether or not you have a particular memory trace and whether or not you engage in a particular act of memory are different questions. So a memory is like the calling to mind of a particular piece of information, which requires a trace, but is separate from, like a trace is necessary but not sufficient for remembering.
Oh, so well, that wouldn't be the way to be able to use the word memory.
No, we use it in lots of ways. So sometimes we're talking about the general capacity, sometimes we're talking about a memory, sometimes we're talking about the activity of engaging in memory. And like that's, I think, part of why that term isn't a helpful one to collapse to is because it's picking out all of those kinds of things. Like it's pesky in those ways. So like remember, like having separate terms that pick out different components or aspects of that could be helpful.
Memory is stored. Remember, the trace is stored.
Yeah.
Memory is recalled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Trace is not recalled.
Yeah. You need a trace to do the recalling, but the recalling is something separate. Yeah.
Sure, you're go
So, is there any way that we can be wrong and at some point losing the
Yeah. 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 So I think we could. I mean, yeah. Yes. I think we could. I mean, right now, there's some people who use it in a very memory proprietary sort of way, and other people who are like, whatever I find using the same cool tools by which they first found these things. So like there are uses. There are now some of the Engram neuroscientists will say things like, I mean, really, the whole brain is memory if you think about it. Like basically anytime the brain is taking in information, it's memory. Like everything is memory. So there's no, Engram is just a word for the brain doing something. It's not a particular kind of activity associated with a particular kind of task or ability. So in some ways it could get diluted to the point that it doesn't have a use. And it is, in that sense, it's popular for the like cellular and molecular people that really think that like ensembles and circuits are like an interesting unit of like neural thing. So that's what matters to them more. They could just start saying ensemble and they don't care about memory and they don't care about engrams in that way. We could also think that this doesn't work. I mean, I think you mean like in terms of falsifying this as a kind of thing that supports memory in different ways? Is that
Well, the specific example I had in mind was for finding that when we encode information, when there's structural change, it's just so distributed.
Yeah.
It doesn't really look like.
Yeah, what someone says. Yeah.
Do we still want to kind of
Yeah.
engram around for some reason?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there could be all sorts of reasons for deciding that. I mean, I think in some ways, like descriptively, like with looking at like why are people using this term now and why is it sticking around? It seems like for them, it's doing the particular work of like you can it might be distributed, but that same so it might be the right like level of entity is some kind of network or ensemble where the units matter, but not in some hyper-specific way. It's more about the kind of connection between a certain set. It's that level that matters for what happens. And as long as you can reinstantiate, it's like, and then that thing is reinstantiable, trackable. That's what makes people say Engram. And people that try to say not Engram try to show that that isn't happening.
Okay, right, so if that's not happening, maybe return back.
Yeah. So some of the place cell people, which is what the like crowd that Sharon Ranganath and other people come from, they actually think of they sometimes will say that engrams are just like misbehaving place cells, like they remap all the time, like they're like malfunctioning, and that's how it's wrong to think they're just bad place cells, and we don't need to think about them as engrams instead. And they kind of read the whole literature in a different way. So if that took hold, then you'd have a kind of anti-engram. I mean, but part of this is it's very, a lot of this is you know this because you work on some other things, it's extracting from what they actually say and do in the methods to what are why do they think they're doing different things? What's different? What's driving what's motivating how they're conceiving of this and what makes it the same now that they can track it over time? Because they do have substantive ideas about what they're what they expect as they're tracking, where's it going to be, what am I looking for, and what kinds of changes are going to be the thing that are still the same thing in that way.
In the Engram Renaissance paper, did they give us any hints as to
What it is they're looking for?
why they are using that term?
Because they think that because they've been able to meet those criteria. So it's the idea of being able to do the necessity and sufficiency. And there were some papers before that had said when they're picking on that stuff where they're saying, well, you haven't shown this yet, and they're now we have literally shown everything. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, you can keep it from turning on. So yeah, it's those criteria. But as things get more complicated, you can do that in different ways, and then you're does it count if you can once you can turn it on, but only with optogenetic, there are these very, very silent engrams where you don't see it in behavior, but it's still in there and you can turn it on with light, which is very disturbing.
Sarah, this has bothered me for a long time.
Yeah.
Maybe this is education to answer this question. So I had Mrs. Schockel in third grade. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Probably, 150, 200 days I sat in that classroom. Okay? Then I have a memory of being in Mrs. Schockel's class. It seems to me there are two options. One is that every single day I took a snapshot, so to speak, of that class.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I remember Mrs. Schockel's third grade class, I'm pulling out some particular, my mind is pulling out some particular episode or day of that time span. And that's the representative of being in Mrs. Schockel's third grade class. The other option is that my memory of Mrs. Schockel's third grade class is somehow an amalgamation or blending of 150 different experiences that isn't identical to any particular snapshot. Is there any empirical work that favors one of those models over the other? And then if it's the first one, what's the randomization mechanism? What selects one snapshot, the one that comes to the conscious recall? If it's the second one, how does the amalgamation happen? I know it's a science stuff.
Yeah, no, but it is super, I mean, I think it is important for like how knowledge is organized, and kind of like it does push on, it gets to philosophical things in the sense of, worrying about structure, representations, and content and things, but it also gets to questions about like the purpose and function of these systems. You might think like part of the way we triangulate on like what's the point of memory? Like what's it? What's the and can it serve the roles we want it to if it's structured in different ways? So I think it does matter, even if some of it's empirical. So there's a host of questions. None of them are great answers to the question, but so sometimes you keep specifics. I mean, the answer is almost surely that it's some kind of combination of those two things, actually. But if sometimes we keep specifics because they're highly anomalous or strange. Like if you always come to colloquia here on Wednesday afternoons, like a lot of them will run together. But the one where someone did jumping jacks, like that will stand. Like someone actually answered their cell phone during a job talk when I was a grad student, and like I will remember that talk forever, forever. They were a Kantian. It was crazy. It was wild. I will never say who they were. But like. Otherwise they all blend together to me, right? But that one, so like when something like that happens, then you remember it. But in general, things you do a lot, like do get this kind of amalgamative quality, but there's a capacity, so there's something, if it's something that you care about and are attending to in the right way, there's a kind of different ways to automate or generalize things. And for things you care about, there are processes, sort of hippocampus, where a lot of this happens in the brain, is well suited to doing something called pattern separation. So it's sort of like, once you've done a lot of something, it's like, oh, you're doing it a lot, I better get really good at differentiating. So the level of detail that I'm going to use for it is going to be such that I can keep track of different instances. So maybe not for days of third grade, but maybe for, if you're a coach watching a lot of drills, like you might actually, like you're trying to keep track of individual performance of, like you're really attending, and so you're going to devote a level of detail that's going to allow differentiation within the kind of pattern that you have, which might be one of these mechanisms that starts to support this specificity, complexity kind of thing. But probably you don't have anything like really episodic, like event sort of level remembering about those days. It would take some kind of complementarity in that way to have that. Like you'd have, sometimes we do this, right? You have like this. The background is kind of why this distinction between episodic and semantic memory that people use a lot is not a fantastic one, kind of memory for facts and general knowledge versus memory for episodes, because there is often this middle quality of like third grade or, your college years or like your grandma, where it has like richly episodic, there's a lot more in there than just like facts and propositions in terms of how it's represented, but it's not like it's one particular episode. But it might have episodes kind of in that ballpark. So, in some sense, it's not always going to be pure in those. There'll be some things that they're going to be closer to purer. But I think this is part of, the kind of teasing them apart that matters. And it feels a lot like when people are trying to start making accounts of perception and they start with like single objects not moving on one table with really good light, and you're like, I'm just trying to start with like a one clear, and it's going to get messy around them. But then we can think about what happens to memory trace as it gets sucked up in all those different ways.
Deborah.
So, Sarah, this was really great. Thank you. There's a lot of clarity you brought to this, and how you set the concepts up. And I don't remember which slide it was on, but at one point I saw the word disposition.
Yeah. Yes.
So if you can make it.
Yeah. I think I was doing it when I was talking about a particular view, but yes, as part of what Philippe thinks about. Yeah. Yeah. No, I support it. Yeah.
Side. And so I like the content vehicle distinction that you give, and I can see the benefits of that to moving explanations forward. But John has me worried because I think it's going to give too much to the neuroscientists to allow them to just operationalize things in terms of what fear is.
Yeah.
Like, they're the ones that get to do that. And the reason I'm worried about that is because of disposition.
Yeah.
So many instances in which the granularity of the operationalized conception is going to be driving whether or not the enrollment has causal effect.
Yeah.
It looked like one did not have the disposition.
Yeah.
Right? And so I don't want to give the scientists that much power. So what can the philosophers say using more of the content?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I don't know if it's an answer that helps or makes it worse. So I actually think, I think that memory traces are dispositions, but I have a very particular view of dispositions that I think keeps the neuroscientist in line. I mean, so it's a very kind of causal powersy style view of what these dispositions are. That's the right way to think about memory traces in those ways, and you can think about, like, so in these kinds of ways, the disposition, like the possession of it, is going to be real prior to any manifestations, in a way that is going to give you, like, the fact that it doesn't express in behavior is not going to be sufficient for lacking. It's not going to be, I mean, that might be how it's identified empirically, but the kind of criteria for having it are going to be sort of preliminary and sort of primary in that kind of a way. It's a particular, there's a whole metaphysical baggage, but I actually think it comes from, like, where the causal theory of memory comes from is from, like, it's one of the few papers about memory that existed before philosophy of memory, this paper by C.V. Martin and Max Deutscher, like, from the 60s. And C.V. Martin, like, went on to develop this kind of view of causal powers in general and never went back to traces as they exist in the causal theory of memory. And I think, like, had he done that, I think he would say that kind of a thing, and I think that's the right way to think about what traces are in that way. I don't know that it's a lot to say in one, but I think there's a way of fixing the worry if I see the worry, and I think I'm sensitive to the same thing. So I think there are ways of, like, it's fine for them to be operational for their purposes, but we can sort of say that's not the be-all, end-all about whether there's a there about that capacity.
So there will be a philosophy talk if other people find helpful, I find.
Good.
Maybe jump to the content vehicle.
I hear.
I find this important because I think these terms are less clear than anything else. Not only is vehicle potential metaphor. I have no idea matter. Are we talking cells? Are we talking protein?
Fair.
When I get to this, I reached a point where, since this was part of the proposal, I didn't know what it was. I'm not sure what it is that we want.
Good. Okay.
That it's going to do something to help. And part of it's tied up in, I'm not tracking this.
Okay. So I don't know how much, so I think it's right, like, whether and how this is helpful for, in part also, like, would that there was a conception in philosophy or a distinction that people just left alone and everyone agreed what it meant and nobody touched it, and then if you did ignore it for 10 years, you could just, like, come back and it was the same. And the content vehicle distinction that I learned in grad school is not the one, like, there's also, like, I've been encountering things lately where I'm like, that's not how dare you? But apparently people have been saying it for a decade, and, like, no. So I'm sensitive to it in that way, that it's like these things, it's always been gestural in that way, so maybe it isn't helpful. I'm not sure the best way to go about answering it. So I started invoking this because I think in some sense a simple version of this distinction, I started invoking it when I started talking to neuroscientists about this connection, because it was actually helpful for them, for, like, helping them kind of disambiguate parts of the project and say, this is the thing. They're like, this is great, this is helpful. I was like, oh, good, maybe I'll try to figure out how to get it back into the broader project. So, like, anecdotally, that's what it's doing in this way. But there's also a sense in which there are different ways that the kind of questions you ask about, like, if you're sort of asking questions about the mental state that's doing this work, there's different kinds of questions you ask when you're sort of looking at the vehicle versus looking at the content, and maybe that's a rough distinction, and maybe it's fine to just say, look, there's different questions, and you don't need to invoke an apparatus to do that. Then, like, maybe that's okay. I don't know if that's getting at where the worry, like the specifics of the worry. I mean, I agree, like, this is like, people, by medium, people mean everything from like syntax to neurons to, yeah.
I mean, as the story talks, medium comes up.
Yeah.
But also, this might seem unhelpful, but in philosophy of art, these terms come up a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
And getting the correct specification of the medium is why a lot of people reject medium as used. But more than that, I guess, trying to separate the content of the medium from whatever by which the content is carried. Let's talk about, again, philosophy of art here. The form is the content.
Yeah, okay.
Like, I'm interested, I'm very open to this being the right distinction.
Yeah.
I'm hesitant in part because I don't see yet a reason to rule out that there's no actual distinction because whatever it is by which the content is carried is just the content.
Yeah, so good. So, yeah, this makes me want to, I lost like a day about a week ago to whether, like, everyone now uses the word format, which I think, and I was like, is that content or is that vehicle? And like, there's like, I lost a day, just a day. I was like, I just wanted a footnote, and now it's ruined. Which I think is this kind of in the same way, like, where does that, on which side does that fall in this way of characterizing things? And I think that that's right in some respects. I mean, yeah, and so like, part of this might come from people getting at like what it is that people want out of this distinction in these kinds of cases where in some sense the particular neurons that do the work, or whether it's even neurons or like ensembles, might matter. It matters that there is an ensemble, but it doesn't matter which ensemble does that kind of work. Is a kind of, that's the sort of thing that might matter here. Or like maybe we care about, I don't, and it's a different can of worms, but like maybe we want there to be a way for this memory to be both in an ensemble of neurons and a kind of, convoluted neural network or something like that.
I'm trying to come up with success conditions for the proposal.
Well, thank you.
We now know this is the level at which explanation is happening. What is it that I would know at the end of the day? Oh, she was right.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, in that sense, I would hope, like, you could get all of that whether you bought the content vehicle stuff at all. So I see the point, like, you could take, like, I'm just using it as a kind of fast way to get at, like, the neuroscience can help give you the conditions on what makes something a trace, and the trace conditions can help give you guidance on how to find mechanisms. And whether you want to think about them in these ways or not, you could probably do it even if you didn't like that distinction or know what it meant. Yeah, that's a good, I appreciate being pushed in that way. Sometimes you think inviting distinctions in is going to fix things for you, and that's, we never learn.
Well, we have reached the end of our time for today, so let's thank Sarah.
Yeah, thanks.